In this section, we'll look at perhaps the two most famous developments in Carter's foreign policy, both of which revolved around the Middle East. The first was the emerging peace talks between Egypt and Israel. After Nixon had laid the groundwork for better relations following the Yom Kippur War and the Arab oil embargo, Carter encouraged further negotiations. And the first break came in November 1977 when Egyptian President Anwar el-Sadat stated that he'd like to go to Israel. The new Israeli premier, Menachem Begin, said with an invitation, come on. In November 1977, Sadat visited Israel, and keep in mind that's a country that Egypt did not recognize, and he was even gave a speech to the Israeli Knesset, its legislature, and he called for a solution to the Palestinian homeland question and for peaceful relationship between Egypt and Israel. In an excellent example of personal diplomacy, Carter then mediated the disputes between Sadat and Begin at the presidential retreat in the Maryland mountains, Camp David. He also made several trips back and forth to the Middle East. The result on March 26, 1979, was a formal peace treaty that became known as the Camp David Accords, and it was really one of Jimmy Carter's greatest accomplishments. The Camp David Accords called for Israel to return the Sinai, which it had occupied since the 67 Six-Day War, to Egypt. In exchange, Egypt would recognize Israel's right to exist and conclude a peace treaty whereby both nations would have normal diplomatic relations and mutually beneficial trade. The U.S. promised $5 billion in economic aid to both countries, and they promised as well to monitor the peace with surveillance flights. The agreement called for UN troops to monitor the new borders. Finally, both countries pledged to continue to seek a solution to the matter of the Palestinian homeland. The worst period of Carter's foreign policy came in 1979 with Iran. For years, Iran had been led by the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who the U.S. had helped install in 1953 after the previously elected president Mohammad Mosaddegh had tried to nationalize Iran's oil industry. Anyway, since the 1950s, the Shah had increasingly governed Iran with an iron fist, employing the brutal police force Savak and kind of ignoring democratic principles. Carter, in time, criticized the Shah's human rights record. But while the Shah did try to liberalize somewhat, the criticism further weakened the Shah's position in Iran. A growing Islamic fundamentalist movement was sweeping over Iran, gaining strength from growing globalization and increasing exposure that Western culture had in the area. And with many Iranians poor, a sense grew that the infidel West was corrupting true Islam for its own benefit. Anyway, in early 1979, trying to calm tensions, the Shah allowed the return from exile in France of the charismatic fundamentalist leader Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. The Shah's plan backfired. The return of Khomeini led to a popular uprising that declared an Islamic Republic in Iran. The Shah had to flee into exile into Egypt. With the Ayatollah Khomeini a religious figure, the new government was technically run by Mehdi Bazargan. Carter still hoped to work with Bazargan, but Khomeini, who wielded tremendous personal power, the real power, was rabidly anti-American, believing the U.S. a sinful and imperialist nation. When the Shah was diagnosed with cancer, Carter, under pressure, decided to allow the exiled leader to enter the United States for treatment. Cancer treatment. He'd been in Mexico, which had been one of the few countries that had agreed to have him. Now, this really ticked off the new rulers in Iran, who were demanding the return of Shah for a trial. So when the Shah arrived in New York in October 1979, anti-American rallies took place all over Iran. Then, on November 4th, 1979, over 3,000 so-called students, undoubtedly controlled by Khomeini, stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held approximately 60 diplomats and staff hostage. Carter rejected a quick military operation fearing casualties and decided on a freeze of millions of dollars of Iranian assets in the United States and a ban on Iranian oil imports. Carter hoped to sort of rally the nations of the world to pressure Iran into negotiations. By April 1980, having found that Khomeini blocked any effort by the official Iranian government to negotiate, Carter finally decided on a rescue mission. The mission called for 8 helicopters from aircraft carriers to rendezvous with 6 C-130 transport planes carrying an American commando team at a remote desert landing strip 600 miles inside Iran. After the rendezvous, the commandos would ride on the helicopters to storm the embassy and free the hostages. Carter was assured that the long occupation had made the student guards lackadaisical. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. Bad luck ended the mission. At the rendezvous point, 2 helicopters malfunctioned. As the mission required all the helicopters to work, Carter called off the rescue attempt. Then, however, as one of the remaining helicopters was taken off, it hit the nose of a transport plane and crashed, killing 6 commandos. The failure of the mission made Carter look foolish and weak in the eyes of the American electorate, and this was only months before the 1980 presidential election. As the election approached, no progress was made in negotiations, and the media counted off the days the hostages had been held every night on TV. Finally, when the Shah died in July 1980, the Iranians' excuse for the hostages had ended, which was an exchange of the hostages for the Shah and so forth. Anyway, its Iranian leaders concluded they had extracted maximum benefit from the situation already. When Iraq invaded Iran in September 1980, Iran no longer had the interest or time to devote to the hostage crisis, and so they decided to release the hostages. I should note that in the end, the Iranian-Iraq war lasted most of the 1980s and was brutal for both nations. Negotiations commenced again, and finally an agreement was reached on January 17, 1981. The U.S. agreed to release some, but not all, of the frozen Iranian assets as part of a complicated settlement. The Iranians ended up releasing the hostages on January 20, 1981, 444 days after the start of the crisis, and only minutes after Ronald Reagan had taken his inaugural presidential oath. The timing was obviously one final slap at Carter by the Iranians. This concludes the section on Carter's Camp David Accords and the Iranian hostage situation.